How do you know about them?
Elementary, my dear Watson. This man has been dead for at least 2 hours.
But how can you be so certain that somebody took one of the bishop's spiders and deliberately placed it in Sir Henry's room? That it wasn't in the luggage he brought from South Africa?
Elementary, my dear Watson. There are no tarantulas in South Africa.
Sherlock Holmes. Really, what can I say that hasn't been said about this legendary character, one of my all-time favorites? Yeah, I know I say that a lot, but hey, anything less than that might not be talking about him. Well, I can begin with Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the stories, who was a doctor that served as a ship's surgeon on cruises around the African coast. Back then, even the Brits were professional badasses. By the way, in my experience, you find him under Doyle, not Conan Doyle, even though that's the name he made his wife take. But the real father of Sherlock Holmes was Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote of the character C. Auguste Dupin in The Murders in the Rue Morgue and some other adventures, which is the true birth of detective fiction, showing how the hero puts facts together and solves the mystery with the subtleties of the mind. When you look at Poe's influences, it's really staggering. While Poe gave birth to it, Doyle perfected it. His first novel was A Study in Scarlet, introducing Dr. James Watson and his other famous character, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He's 6 feet tall, thin as a board, with sharp, piercing eyes loaded with a fierce intelligence. He can tell the dings of someone by merely looking at them. People would insist he had some kind of magic power, but he could tell that Watson had been in Afghanistan because of his skin tan and his soldierly habits. He puts these skills to good use as a consulting detective for Scotland Yard and helps them solve a murder. The novel then turns into a western of sorts. I know about those, right? Telling how the people came to be in their situation. And it wasn't a big success. Yeah, it made some cash and was widely known, but people didn't like the way the mystery was solved, but they liked the character of the man Sherlock, and so a sequel was commissioned, The Sign of Four. The Sign of Four delves more into the personality of Holmes, introducing his famous drug usage with cocaine. It also tells of how Watson met his wife, trying to add a little romance because Sherlock would lend himself to such trivialities. It tells of a woman who receives a mysterious gift of 6 pearls and suspects it's entwined with the disappearance of her father some time before. Holmes sets his keen mind to reasoning, figuring out the problem with a clue we didn't see. It again goes into the details of how these people came to be in these circumstances after Holmes does his thing, a motif we're going to see a lot. The Sign of Four was, again, a modest success, though Conan Doyle set to a new line of marketing for future Holmes adventures. Short stories published in The Strand magazine. The first of these was called A Scandal in Bohemia and featured one of Holmes's most famous rivals, a Miss Irene Adler, whom he describes as the woman, Watson. The summation of her entire sex. He, of course, had no interest in women, and the story is not a romance or even a tantalization between them. Many writers have adjusted Irene to be a love interest in more modern films, trying, erroneously, to give Holmes a more human edge. Of course, it makes more sense that Holmes is asexual, so wrapped up in his logic and thinking that he has no room for the company of women. Or men, if you insist on those interpretations, which really adds to the complexity of his character. Or they just want to bring in the female crowd for the movies. That could be it. Anyway, the first 12 stories featuring the detective were eventually collected into The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Many of these are considered the best of Doyle's entire body of work, like our previous entry, The Red-Headed League, which he ranked second in his list of favorites. Yeah, he had a list. The Blue Carbuncle, A Christmas Story, and one of my favorites, The Speckled Band. Doyle ranked this as his favorite Sherlock story, too. The next collection, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, begins with one of his most popular stories, Silver Blaze. It tells of how he finds a missing racehorse and has one of Sherlock's most quoted lines here.
Is there any other point to which you wish to draw my attention, Mr. Holmes?
To the curious incident of the dog in the night time.
But the dog did nothing in the night time.
That is the curious incident.
That was also used as the title of a great novel by Mark Haddon, kind of in the Sherlock Holmes vein, so I figured I'd mention it. Highly recommended, too. The collection goes on to feature The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, which was heavily censored due to its grotesque nature of murder, sex, and betrayal. And gore. Dude, it's messed up. It also features The Gloria Scott and The Musgrave Ritual, in which Holmes recounts his 2 earliest adventures to Watson, showing his origin like any superhero. It also has The Greek Interpreter, which introduces Holmes' brother, Mycroft, whom he claims is smarter and an even better deducer than himself, but far too fat and lazy to get anything done. Lastly, there was The Final Problem, which introduced Holmes' most famous villain, Professor James Moriarty. Described as the Napoleon of crime, he is a ruthless mastermind, a spider sitting in a cobweb, knowing every quiver of it. Holmes tracks him from England all the way to Switzerland, engaging him in a climactic duel at the Reichenbach Falls. I think part of the genius of the story is that Watson, who's narrating it, never sees Moriarty. He gets a little passing glimpse of him in one scene, but truly, the villain makes no actual appearance. There's no Hannibal Lecter-style match of wits, no villain monologue, just a ghost that takes Holmes with him. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that Holmes dies within this story, as Doyle was starting to get tired of him. Doyle didn't like Holmes as much as his readers, and he felt that they were just a hobby that managed to earn him quite a bit of cash. He didn't like the rather grisly subject matter, nor the incredibly complex plots he had to do. Think about it, in order to write Holmes, he had to be as smart as Holmes himself, and that opens up an interesting question. Was Doyle truly as intelligent as the great detective? I mean, he had to know everything that Holmes knew. True, he could simply look it up in an encyclopedia at a moment's notice, but he had to know to look it up. And he, of course, didn't have to find the clues scattered about a room of murder or whatever. He simply placed them there and ordered Holmes to find them at his will. But again, he had to know what to place where and find a way for Holmes to notice it. I've always thought that mystery writers would make the perfect criminals because, well, they would know what to do and how to get away with it. Don't fuck with crime writers, dude. Anywho, after Doyle was stretching his mind with other works, he returned to Sherlock with his third crime novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles. This is widely regarded to be the best Holmes adventure, featuring an intricate web of lies and deceit with a horrific monster laying in the century of it, allowing Holmes to unravel it all in a most spectacular fashion. He of course goes out and acts mysterious, figuring it all out with some clue we didn't see, but still, it all melds together nicely. It was supposed to have taken place before The Final Problem, being an untold tale of Holmes. Its rampant success led to Doyle finally resurrecting the character in The Empty House. This story tells of how Holmes escaped Moriarty, faking his death to capture some more people who were hot on his trail. These 13 stories were published in a volume aptly named The Return of Sherlock Holmes, though only the first makes a big deal of him having been formerly dead. It features one of the most famous Holmes stories with The Dancing Men, wherein Holmes has to decipher a code written up featuring some strange dancing figures.
We can dance if we want to, we can leave your friends behind, 'cause your friends don't dance, and if they don't dance, well they're no friends of mine.
Doyle listed this as his third favorite story. Another one I particularly like is The Adventure of Black Peter. Oh my god, I just realized the subtext of that, which is essentially about Holmes going up against a pirate. Some other popular ones include The Golden Pince-Nez, The Six Napoleons, and The Second Stain. Not much else to say on this collection. Next came the fourth and final novel of Holmes, called The Valley of Fear, wherein Holmes has to find someone who's hiding in plain sight. Again, the bulk of the story is the victim recounting how he got to be in his situation, telling of love and gold in old California. It's also supposed to take place before The Final Problem, and it's instigated that Professor Moriarty is involved with the crime. Though this should create a plot hole, as in The Final Problem, Watson had never heard of Moriarty, but this adventure should have been... screw it. He was in the Negazone. The next 7 stories were collected in His Last Bow. My favorite of these is called The Dying Detective, wherein it looks as though Holmes is on his deathbed. I mean, I think you can see the twist coming from a mile away, but that's what I like about it. As the title suggests, the last story in the collection is called His Last Bow, wherein Holmes isn't in a detective story, but has taken on the role of a spy in the days just before World War I. It was published at the height of the war in 1917. Granted, his spying really doesn't make any sense in how he goes about it, but it was really just a propaganda piece. It's also supposed to be the last chronological story of Holmes, being his last bow before the new age of the Great War ushers in, throwing away the old. So the next... Wait a minute, Holmes was a secret agent? Should have known. The last collection is called The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, and is pretty hit or miss. They're supposed to take place before Holmes got old and retired, though one that's narrated by Holmes himself where he's elderly. There's another that Holmes again narrates, though it's supposed to be when Watson was off doing something with his wife. Poor guy. There's really not much here. Some might even call this the dregs of Holmes. So, what is there to say in the end? Holmes is still a magnanimous icon all throughout the world, one of the most famous people who never existed. It's arguable he was the first superhero, really. I mean, if we're counting Batman, why not him? There have been countless movies made of him, starring actors from Basil Rathbone to Peter Cushing, my personal favorite, to Johnny Lee Miller and Benedict Cumberbatch. Hey, those movies don't count. Shut up. Not to mention thousands and thousands of TV cop shows which essentially employ his methods, just slightly updated, and some are even adapted straight from his adventures. There's also medical shows like House that draw straight from him. House, Holmes, get it? This is apt since Conan Doyle was a doctor himself and based Sherlock Holmes on Dr. Joseph Bell, a real surgeon. There's also plenty of spins on Holmes himself. One of my earliest introductions to him was the Saturday morning cartoon Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century. This all just goes to show how much universal appeal Holmes has, and how he survived throughout the years and won the immortality that all writers seek. There are fanzines which reprint new adventures of the man from modern authors. There are Holmesian scholars who pore over the books with a religious fervor. It should seem even the rigors of death could not stop Mr. Sherlock Holmes.